Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Flooding from Hurricane Melissa kills at least 20 in Haiti as Jamaica's declared a disaster area after being struck by the storm. US President Donald Trump has finalized a trade deal with South Korea and says he believes the US is going to have a deal with China ahead of meeting Xi Jinping tomorrow. Israeli military says it's carried out a targeted strike in the northern Gaza Strip as officials say earlier strikes have killed more than 100 people. Trump says the ceasefire agreement still stands. Now, flooding from Hurricane Melissa has killed at least 20 in Haiti. The storm also struck Cuba with winds of up to 115 miles per hour and heavy rain, flooding roads and homes. Last night, it hit Jamaica, which has been declared a disaster area by its Prime Minister. President Trump said the US is prepared to send humanitarian aid to help. Take a listen.
I've never seen numbers like that. I saw it a little while ago, 195-mile-an-hour wind. I've never seen that before. I've never seen, I guess it can get that high, but I've never seen it. And it's literally just, knocking down everything in front of it. It's a stage 5, I guess. And you don't see stage 5. You don't see 5s very often. You see 4s and 3s, but this is a 5 early on, meaning it gets worse. So it's done a tremendous job. You mean on Jamaica? On a humanitarian basis, we have to. So we're watching it closely and we're prepared to move. But it's doing tremendous damage. It's, as we speak, it's right there right now.
For more on this, I'm joined by Rodney Martinez, who is a representative from the World Meteorological Organization in Northern and Central America and the Caribbean. Rodney, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. First of all, Melissa was the strongest storm to ever hit Jamaica. What is the extent of the damage caused by this natural disaster?
Thank you for the invitation. Yes, we have a hurricane of Category 5, which has particularities in terms of the rapid intensification process. 2 times it experienced a rapid intensification process that increased the speed and the strength of the system in 48 hours, and just basically entering in the country with more than 300 kilometers per hour. So the speed and the characteristics of the systems it strikes the island in the western side, and the important thing here is that the early warning systems were functioned very well. All the national authorities were following the system very in advance, and they were very prepared. So that's the reason why, despite of all the damage in the infrastructure, which is critical, it's a disaster zone, because the strength of the system. In the case of Jamaica, there are 3 fatalities. That with the dimension of this hurricane, that is a number that just denotate the importance of the early warning system and the preparation of the country. But despite of all this preparation, the strength of the system is really devastating. So now Jamaica is experiencing a lot of structural damage, and the recovery will be certainly will be hard and costly for the country, and all the aid is needed to really reactivate the activities in the island.
The hurricane is currently making its way across eastern Cuba as I'm talking to you. It's now been downgraded to a Category 3. What does that actually mean?
Well, considering all the evolution of the system through Jamaica, so it loses a lot of energy, and now it's a Category 3 in Cuba, where all the actions were taken. So more than 700,000 people evacuated on time. So we are expecting at least, of course, infrastructural damage there, flooding, but at least so far no fatalities reported in Cuba. In contrast, in Haiti, we have the problem of a lot of vulnerability associated with the situation in Haiti, and that is why we are we have more than 20 persons, 20 fatalities there. So the system is moving northward and will cross to Bahamas, but with less intensity. So that what we can learn from all of this is the differences in terms of impacts, at least on fatalities, based on the national systems and the governance systems and the vulnerabilities ahead. So there is also the message of keep building on early warning system, keep building on and investing on the national Met services, national meteorological services to provide a effective early warning system that save lives and at least allows to countries to mitigate the impacts of extreme events, which are now more frequent in the Caribbean area.
And you mentioned there that it is heading towards the Bahamas. What is the path of the hurricane once it's moved through that area? What happens? Does it eventually burn out and disappear?
Well, as far as we are looking now, is the system is moving northeast, and of course we cross Bahamas, and we are expecting that the speed of the system could be reduced on time, but with all the uncertainty that we have in the ocean, because the ocean is very warm, and we experience this phenomena of rapid intensification in areas where the ocean has a lot of heat content associated with all the warming in the planet, and that is the fuel of the system. So we should expect the normal reduction of the strength of the system along its moving north, but we need to be continue monitoring carefully, just in case there is an intensification process that we are not looking now.
And it's really interesting because in the next few weeks, the COP30 summit will be held in Brazil. You mentioned there to me how warm the ocean is and the heat fueling the system. How much is climate change fueling Hurricane Melissa's ferocity?
Well, when we look at the record of the registers of hurricanes in the region, yes, Melissa is now one of the 10 top hurricanes because the strength of the system. But we have past events like this. The particularity that could be associated with the global warming is the rapid intensification process. This rapid intensification process is defined with a significant increase of the speed of the system, of the winds, in a period of 24 hours. With Melissa, we experienced this twice, and this why the increase of the speed was from basically 112 kilometers per hour to more than 300 kilometers per hour in a very short period of time. That is associated with the big amount of heat content in the ocean. In normal conditions, by seasonal characteristics, in this time in the year, the Caribbean is warm, but the levels of heat content now in the ocean are not normal, are far, far, far from normal. And that is associated with all the heat that the ocean is absorbing from the atmosphere due to the greenhouse emissions and the global warming. So that is a fact. And this particular aspect is what we can connect this intensity process with climate change.
Rodney Martinez, it was great to have you on the show, and thank you for your analysis on Hurricane Melissa. Now, US President Donald Trump has finalized a trade deal with South Korea following months of talks over the implementation of a framework agreement struck back in July. It covers a $350 billion pledge by Seoul for investment in the American economy. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has heaped praise on Donald Trump as he nailed down an agreement with the US president. Frank Smith reports.
The agreement between U.S. President Donald Trump and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung on tariffs and trade took many here by surprise, with South Korea agreeing on a $350 billion investment into the U.S. for relief from the high tariffs. The tariff rate on exports to the U.S. from South Korea is going to go down from 25% to 15%. But in terms of the $350 billion, that money is going to be dispersed in various ways that offer South Korea perhaps a little bit of a benefit compared to just the upfront cash payment that President Trump had previously demanded. $150 billion of that will go directly into U.S. shipbuilding with South Korean companies. And there'll be a limit on the overall investment of $20 billion per year. South Korea will also have input on where this money goes and more equity and receipt of the benefits or profits that these investments earn. All that's left is China. China has pushed back quite significantly on Trump's tariffs, banning the export of rare earth minerals to the U.S. that are so critical to American industry. Those negotiations, though, between China and the U.S., experts say, will take more time.
For more on this, I'm joined by Asia political analyst Darrell Feingold. Ross, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so Donald Trump has had a tremendous amount of energy on his Asian tour, we must say that. But tomorrow he meets President Xi Jinping of China. Where do you think Trump stands in Asia, and how will his meeting go with President Xi?
The leaders in the region, like in other parts of the world where Trump has already had significant interaction over the past 8 months that he's been in office, the leaders in Asia know that Trump's focus when it comes to foreign policy, first and foremost, is on trade and on America's trade relationship with other countries. We saw that in his first trip to the Middle East, where a number of the Persian Gulf countries made significant commitments to invest in the U.S., to buy U.S. aircraft, to buy U.S. weapons. We've seen that with the European Union, which reached a trade deal with President Trump. And we've seen that over the past 4 or 5 months as negotiations proceeded with countries like Japan and South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and culminating in those deals that have been announced, whether when he was in Kuala Lumpur over the weekend, or in Japan, or in South Korea. So the leaders know that Trump is focused on trade. Now, of course, there's always the security issues, and the U.S. is a treaty ally of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, and has significant security relationships with other countries in the region, like Singapore, Taiwan, and Thailand, increasingly with Vietnam as well. But again, the leaders in the region know that the best way to maintain a strong relationship with Trump is to talk trade, is to facilitate U.S. products entering their markets, facilitate U.S. investment in their countries, and then also in return seek a good deal, or the best deal that they could obtain as far as what tariffs the Trump administration will impose on their goods.
Let's speak about that, because since President Trump's tariffs on China in his first term, China has done a really good job at diversifying its economy and setting up markets. Which country has the upper hand in this trade war? Is it China or the US? Because it appears to a lot of people and analysts, Trump and Xi are going into tomorrow's meeting as partners, where Donald Trump has normally had the upper hand due to the tariffs.
One thing I'd remind the audience is to be a little suspicious when an analyst says China plays the long game. While that may be true, it's also one of the most often repeated phrases in analysis of China's economic or political or other policies. The reality is that China still wants access to the U.S. markets for its manufacturers, although China has diversified to other markets like the Middle East and Africa and Europe. The United States is still a crucial market for Chinese exporters. That's a lot of companies. That's a lot of jobs, and China doesn't want to jeopardize that. So, of course, China wants to get the lowest tariff possible on its manufactured goods, whether that's shoes, textiles, consumer electronics. The U.S. is still a crucial market. And when it comes to one of the other really important issues for President Trump, and that's the export of agricultural goods. Although China has stopped buying U.S. agricultural exports for the most part, and significantly soybeans as part of the trade dispute, the reality is China was happy to buy from the U.S. because it's good product, it's good quality product, the price was good, and it was a long-term relationship between the U.S. farmers or exporters and the Chinese buyers. And frankly, the logistic chain was excellent as well. It's very easy to ship from the U.S. West Coast to Chinese ports. It's a lot more troublesome for China to import soybeans from Brazil or other countries. So China wants to do business with the United States. That's very clear. And I'm bringing all this up because I think it does show that China also has urgency to make a deal as well. Of course, Trump has his own concerns. For example, higher tariffs, if they were to be maintained at higher levels, that raises costs for U.S. consumers and it leads to inflation. Trump is plenty aware of that. Trump is also aware of the critical minerals issue, and he wants to restore U.S. access to those exports from China as well, while at the same time the U.S. is trying to build a domestic or alternative sources working with countries like Australia. But again, both countries want to do business with each other. Neither leader is talking about completely cutting off trade with the other.
Yes, of course, the world's two biggest economies, and as you do so, they do say they want to trade with each other. But I want to just drill in a little bit more into the rare earth minerals that you just mentioned there, because this has been part of the tit for tat between China and the US. They said China, they would curb the exports of rare earth minerals, which are vital to the US economy, from everything from washing machines to weapons that are made. And you bring up the soya beans, which is something agriculturally important for the US. So do you think that we'll see the temperature die down when it comes to these rare earth minerals?
It's likely. I mean, the signals coming from the negotiations led on the U.S. side by Treasury Secretary Bessent a few days ago, the signals were positive. He said there's a deal in reach. And that's why the two leaders are going to be meeting on Thursday, because it's really likely that they have something to announce. But we also have to be realistic. Based on the past 6-7 years of experience, ever since trade tensions began around 2018 during President Trump's first term, we know that deals could be reached, but often they do fall apart. And we saw that most notably with the so-called Phase 1 trade agreement that China and the U.S. reached in January of 2020, where frankly China never reached the targets as far as procurement from the United States, whether that was agricultural goods or the other commitments in that agreement. It was interrupted by COVID-19, and the Biden administration didn't really follow up on trying to enforce that agreement. So we could be optimistic if there is a deal reached or announced on Thursday or sometime after. But again, we have to be realistic. There's a number of real differences of opinion across a range of issues, not just trade, obviously. The political issues are very stark as far as disagreements go. And any trade agreement could be disrupted sometime in the next 6 months, 2 years. It's certainly possible it's not going to last forever.
Cautious optimism, I think, Ross, is the word when we're talking about this, China and the US. But I want to move on just to ask you about NVIDIA, because today NVIDIA has become the world's first company to be worth $5 trillion. It's now worth as much as the German economy. What is driving NVIDIA stock right now?
Certainly the extraordinary investment that companies are making in AI, whether that's companies who operate data centers, services in the cloud, or the end users of AI in the corporate world or the scientific world, it's clear for the near term that the demand is extraordinary, and NVIDIA is the best maker, or it makes the best chips for use in AI applications. It does have competitors. AMD is a competitor. Intel is trying desperately to catch up and making some progress, even though it has many problems to resolve. But NVIDIA is the leader. And another thing NVIDIA is doing very, very smartly is it's investing in other companies within the semiconductor or AI ecosystem. So it's expanding its relationships in a very smart and rapid way. We've seen that with some of the announcements that have been made over the course of 2025 after Trump took office, as far as very large investments in data centers, or again, these cross investments that companies in the industry are making. And NVIDIA is right there in the middle. And NVIDIA has also been very smart about maintaining strong relationships with governments around the world. Jensen Huang has been to the White House multiple times this year. He traveled with President Trump to London, to the Middle East, now to Asia, and he's been to China multiple times this year as well, trying to maintain a open communication with the Chinese government, even though the Chinese have implemented what appears to be a ban on buying NVIDIA chips at the moment. So he's also a brilliant PR relationship manager, in addition to being a brilliant engineer.
Ross, thank you so much for your analysis. Brilliant to have you on the show. And I will remember when another analyst says China is playing the long game. Thanks once again. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. A migrant sex offender who was mistakenly released from a UK prison has been deported to Ethiopia. The British government's confirmed he was given over $500 in payment after threatening to disrupt his deportation. The Ethiopian was jailed after sexually assaulting a teenage girl and a woman in Essex whilst living in an asylum hotel. President Putin has said Russia successfully tested a nuclear-capable and nuclear-powered underwater drone. It's the second test of a nuclear-capable Russian weapon in a week. Whilst making the announcement, Putin said there was no way to intercept the drone. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky has condemned what he described as a deliberate attack on a children's hospital by Russia. He said around 100 people were inside the hospital at the time of that attack. Now, 60 people have been killed during a massive police operation against drug trafficking in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro. As many as 12,500 heavily armed officers, backed by armoured vehicles, helicopters and drones, took part in the bust. The state governor described the operation as the largest in the state's history. And an 18-year-old Australian woman has been found dead on an island in the Great Barrier Reef after being left behind by a cruise ship she was travelling on. The woman, who has not been named yet, had joined a group hike on Saturday before she decided to rest. The incident occurred during the first stop of the 60-day cruise around Australia. Israeli military says it's carried out a targeted strike in the northern Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Gaza's civil defense agency and hospitals have said a series of other strikes have killed more than 100 people across the Palestinian territory. The Israeli military have issued a statement saying that a soldier was killed during fighting in southern Gaza. Meanwhile, President Trump has said that the US-backed ceasefire in Gaza is not at risk. For more on this, I'm joined by the former Israeli government spokesperson, Elon Levy, who is in Tel Aviv. Elon, thanks so much for your time this evening. Always a pleasure to have you join me on the show. So Gaza's House Ministry says a total of 104 people were killed in Israeli strikes last night. 46 children and 20 women lost their lives in those strikes. Why is it women and children we are hearing about today?
Israel conducted a wave of precision strikes on Hamas military targets overnight. That came in response to Hamas's flagrant violation of the ceasefire, killing one soldier just after the gruesome footage of Hamas burying hostages' remains and then digging them up for the cameras. Israel is interested in restoring deterrence because Hamas is testing the limits to see how much it can get away with, and Israel has to set limits. Now, I don't know the exact breakdown of who was killed in that strike, although Israel says it targeted dozens of Hamas military figures, including those who took part in the October 7th massacre. And we should, of course, take what the Hamas authorities in Gaza say with a pinch of salt. But if it's true that civilians were killed, that is first, deeply sad and tragic, and two, a reminder that Hamas embeds its military machine inside and among civilian areas. And it's a reminder of why this war has to end with the full implementation of the Trump peace plan and Hamas's demilitarization. So it cannot keep doing this. And that, of course, is what Hamas is desperate to avoid.
Okay, Elon, you say you don't know those numbers, but I can give them to you. Health officials in Gaza have said 104 people killed, and as I said, 46 children and 20 women did lose their lives. But let's move on, because Israel says it conducted a targeted strike in the northern Gaza Strip. That was just about half an hour ago before we did come to air. What happens now?
Israel expects Hamas to release all of the bodies of the hostages it is holding. We're not out of phase one of the deal, and Hamas is not giving back the hostages. In fact, it's playing games. Yesterday, Israel released drone footage of Hamas burying body parts and then digging them up again for the Red Cross. Hamas knows where the body parts are, and it can give them back. The reason Hamas is not doing that is that it doesn't want to move to phase two of the Trump peace plan. Phase two is Hamas's demilitarization and removal from power. And even its Qatari patrons are now getting fed up. The Prime Minister of Qatar saying just moments ago in the US that Hamas violated the ceasefire and needs to move towards demilitarization. That's what needs to happen now. Hamas has to complete phase one. It has to give back the bodies of all 13 hostages it is still holding, and then it must be removed from power and demilitarized so that we can finally put this war behind us and move towards reconstruction of Gaza and not the reconstruction of Hamas's military machine.
Qatar's Prime Minister, Elon, also said that the attack on the Israeli soldier and the subsequent Israeli airstrikes have been very disappointing and frustrating to us. Do you think that we'll actually ever get to the second phase of the ceasefire deal? Because from what the world is seeing, it's so fragile. And once again, Israel killed 104 people last night, another targeted strike today. Is Israel upholding its side of the bargain right now?
Israel wants the full implementation of the Trump peace plan. Its goals in this war that Hamas started were to get the hostages back and to remove Hamas from power so it can never invade and take hostages again. Israel wants the implementation of all 20 points of the Trump peace plan: disarmament, demilitarization, de-radicalization, the lot. Hamas does not, because for Hamas to accept Trump's peace plan is essentially to admit defeat. But Hamas did not want to free the living hostages either. And it did it because of pressure from its patrons, its state sponsors, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt. They told it, game's over, the hostages are a liability, you have to free them. And the only way we will move to phase two is if those same countries pressure Hamas to demilitarize and lay down its arms. Hamas doesn't want to do that. It is, of course, a jihadist regime whose reason for existing is to continue waging war against Israel. And I'll say one more thing. A new poll from the Palestinian Center for Policy Research found that support for Hamas has gone up since the October 7th massacre. It's by far the most popular Palestinian political party, and a majority of Palestinians, including in the Gaza Strip, still think the decision to go to war on October 7th was the correct decision. So I think Hamas thinks that October 7th has made it stronger, and that's why it wants to prepare for the next one. And that's why we need massive global pressure on Hamas to end this living nightmare it started.
You know, Elon, every time we talk, it's always a speech about Hamas. And sometimes I just want to find out what Israel is currently thinking and what their plans are. But let's talk a little bit about aid. Israel has allowed some humanitarian aid into Gaza, but supplies have been well below the 600 trucks a day that was specified in that ceasefire ceasefire agreement that you say Israel is committed to. What is Israel's justification for so little aid at the moment going into the Gaza Strip?
Israel's policy is that any aid that aid organizations want to bring into the Gaza Strip, they're welcome to coordinate. The United Nations is responsible for only something like 30% of the aid that goes into Gaza. There are many other aid agencies that the UN is not counting. It's important that aid get to the people who need it while making sure that Hamas can't steal it. And I'm sorry if you think that every answer is a speech about Hamas, but Hamas is the main belligerent in this war. It's trying to crack down and reassert its hold on power. It's going to try to divert supplies. And it's important that aid agencies be able to get food to the people who need it without Hamas being able to divert it in order to restock its machine. Israel's policy, any trucks of aid the UN wants to coordinate, it can coordinate. And when it does coordinate more trucks get in.
Elon, I think this is where the frustration lies, because you and I and so many people watching our TVs, watching social media, we see these horrific pictures of starving people inside of Gaza. And that's something that's really driving people's feelings towards this cause and towards the Palestinians. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Netanyahu, because he appeared in court yesterday for his corruption trial. And I just wonder, is domestic politics playing into the latest strikes on Gaza? Because we know Netanyahu is desperate to cling on to power.
Well, Israel is now in elections year. Elections will have to take place within the next year. And Netanyahu is going to have to contend with, on the one hand, public pressure that he was in power when the October 7th massacre happened. On the other hand, he's going to try to claim credit for the fact that Israel is now in its strongest strategic and military position it's ever been. I think Netanyahu will also want to reach more normalization agreements before the next election, maybe with Indonesia, hopefully with Saudi Arabia itself, because he wants that to be his legacy. But right now, Israel faces a military challenge that any leader would have to contend with. The Hamas regime is not disarming. It's not demilitarizing. It's consolidating power. It's trying to redig its tunnels. It's not freeing the hostages' bodies as it is meant to do under the ceasefire. And it is continuing deadly attacks that have so far killed 3 Israeli soldiers since the ceasefire went into effect. And any Israeli leader would not be able to let Hamas just get away with that, or Hamas will just keep on killing Israeli soldiers with impunity. Israel needs to restore deterrence to make it clear that Hamas cannot continue its aggression. And what needs to happen next is that all the hostages' remains come home, and then we move to phase 2, about which there is consensus within Israel, that Hamas has to lay down its arms and let everyone move on to the full implementation of the Trump plan.
Yes, of course, and I think there's consensus across the world that Hamas does disarm. Elon Levy, always good to have you on the show. Thank you. For more on this, I'm joined by Hani Sabri, who's the founder of Aleph Advisory, a New York-based Middle East-focused and political risk analysis firm. Hani, it's brilliant to have you on the show. Don't know if you heard my conversation with former Israeli government spokesperson Elon Levy. Just your reaction to that, because, you know, so many of us right now wondering, why is the ceasefire breaking down just 3 weeks after President Trump's visit to the Middle East and that big summit, of course, that happened in Sharm el-Sheikh? And if you listen to Elon Levy, he says Israel are completely committed to the ceasefire and it's all Hamas's fault.
I'm not surprised that the ceasefire appears to be collapsing before our eyes. That's not a surprise. If you look at the way the ceasefire was designed, the structure of the ceasefire, it was always designed to be fragile. Beyond the structure of the ceasefire, I think there are 2 crystal clear elements that demonstrated that the ceasefire was probably going to collapse on the day it was signed. I think the first piece of evidence we have is the fact that there has been a ceasefire technically between Israel and Lebanon for the last 11 and a half months. And yet in that time frame, Israeli strikes on Lebanon have been fairly routine, fairly regular. Now, if you ask US officials or you ask Israeli officials, is that ceasefire still intact? They'll say yes. If you ask the residents of southern Lebanon, is the ceasefire still intact? They would say absolutely not. So I think if you look at this ceasefire and compare it to what happened in Lebanon, there's no reason to think that the Israel-Hamas ceasefire would be different. The second element, I think, is that if you look at the 6 months preceding the conclusion of this ceasefire, you'll see that Israel resisted U.S. diplomatic intervention to reach a ceasefire. Now, the reason Israel did that is because the U.S. diplomatic intervention didn't constitute actual pressure, right? There was intervention, but not pressure. When the U.S. applied pressure, the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire, right? Hamas is the weaker party. They had agreed in large part to this ceasefire many months ago. I think the problem is that the U.S. hasn't sustained that pressure. And I think politically, when you look at the fact that Israel doesn't want the ceasefire to move to phase 2 and phase 3, particularly Netanyahu doesn't, and you look at the U.S.-Israel relationship, you'll see that the U.S.-Israel relationship will supersede a U.S. commitment to a Hamas-Israel ceasefire and the work necessary to maintain it. So I'm not surprised that this happened overnight. This had been my view well before the agreement was reached and even when the agreement was reached.
You know, we talked there about your view on the ceasefire, and we've discussed it extensively, how fragile it is on this show. But also, we talk about the number of deaths, and obviously, we hoped a ceasefire would come in place to stop that, which doesn't appear to be happening. And President Trump has said nothing would jeopardize the ceasefire, adding Israel should hit back when its soldiers were targeted. But let's talk a little bit more about this relationship between the US and Israel, and Donald Trump no longer sustaining the pressure on Israel, which many people hoped he would. So what's the prospects going forward for any sort of peace agreement or any kind of halt to what's been happening?
The prospects are good. I think the prospects are quite poor. I think even when you think about the sort of the theatrics surrounding the ceasefire, right? Trump went to the Israeli Knesset and Trump said that he resolved a 3,000-year-old conflict, and then he went to Sharm el-Sheikh and there was a large banner that said Peace 2025. And the reality is that what was negotiated was a narrow, rickety, weak ceasefire. It wasn't a peace deal. And the likelihood of a peace deal, I think, is infinitesimal, close to zero. I think that's highly unlikely. Now, when you look at this from Trump's perspective, right, Trump wants to present this as a peace agreement. Trump wants to present this as a largely transformative element because Trump wants to use any momentum from the perception that this is a peace agreement to expand the Abraham Accords. You know, we've seen a strong willingness on the part of Ahmed al-Shara in Syria to essentially, want to join the ranks of Western accepted nations. So Trump wants to use that momentum to say, okay, well, we're going to get Syria to join the Abraham Accords or reach some kind of security arrangement with Israel. Obviously, the big prize for Trump would be Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. I think that that's highly unlikely. But in Trump's mind, there's the element of delivering a big diplomatic success. And remember the timing of this, Trump wanted to win a Nobel Prize. So delivering that success, but then also achieving some other sort of large benefits associated with it. Again, I think that the probability that Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords is relatively low. I don't think the conditions are right for something like that. But I think that that's probably what's animating Trump. And you had a previous guest before Eilon Levy who discussed trade deals. I think Trump believes that, if you can get some of these other countries to join the Abraham Accords, then he can expand trade relationships.
Hani, we're out of time, but just one quick question. Do you think Trump will get the Nobel Peace Prize before his term ends, yes or no?
If I were a betting man right now, I'd say no, but things could change.
Yeah, definitely. Hani Sabra, thank you so much for joining us. A reminder of our top stories. Flooding from Hurricane Melissa kills at least 20 in Haiti as Jamaica's declared a disaster area after being struck by the storm. US President Donald Trump has finalized a trade deal with South Korea and says he believes the US is going to have a deal with China ahead of meeting Xi Jinping tomorrow. Israeli military says it carried out a targeted strike in the northern Gaza Strip as officials say earlier strikes have killed more than 100 people. Trump says the ceasefire agreement does indeed still stand. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on X. We'll be back in a couple of hours' time with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.